Hi guys. So I am going to hold off for a second and see if anybody joins before I start reading. For those of you who don't know, and most of you probably do, I am Lindsay, and I actually am an assistant teacher with the school district here in Albany. And I'm going to be reading with you guys for the next few weeks. We're going to try and, hi Heather, I'm going to try and read through Charlie and the Chocolate Factory with you guys by Roald Dahl. And I'm going to do this every day at 1 so that we can have a chance to all connect and read a story and get to know this wonderful book, because lots of you get to watch the movies, but very few of you guys get to read the books. Hi, Kaylee. I'm so glad you're here to listen to me read. I miss you, girly. So I'm going to go ahead and start. We're going to start with the first chapter, and I'll show you guys the pictures as we get to them, because there are a few pictures in this book. All right. So here we go. Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. The first chapters. Here comes Charlie. These two very old people are the father and mother of Mr. Bucket, and their names are Grandpa Joe and Grandma Josephine. So that's Grandma Joe and Grandpa Josephine. Or Grandma Josephine. I can't talk, guys. These two very old people are the father and mother of Mrs. Bucket. Their names are Grandpa George and Grandma Georgina. This is Mr. Bucket and Mrs. Bucket. So here is Grandpa George and Grandma Georgina. And here are Mr. and Mrs. Bucket. Mr. and Mrs. Bucket have a small boy whose name is Charlie Bucket. This is Charlie. How do you do? How do you do? And how do you do? Again, he is pleased to meet you. The whole of his family, the 6 grown-ups, count them, and little Charlie Bucket live together in a small wooden house on the edge of a great town. This is their house. The house wasn't nearly large enough for so many people, and life was extremely uncomfortable for all of them. There were only 2 rooms in the place altogether. There was only 1 bed. The bed was given to the 4 old grandparents because they were so old and tired. They were so tired, they never got out of it. Grandpa Joe and Grandma Josephine on one side, and Grandpa George and Grandma Georgina on the other side. Mr. and Mrs. Bucket and little Charlie Bucket slept in the other room on mattresses on the floor. So here's the grandparents in their bed. And then this is Charlie and his parents sleeping on the floor. In the summertime, this wasn't too bad, but in the winter, freezing cold drafts blew across the floor all night long, and it was awful. There wasn't any question of them being able to buy a better house or even one more bed to sleep in. They were far too poor for that. Mr. Bucket was the only person in the family with a job. He worked at the toothpaste factory, where he sat all day long and where he sat all day long at the bench and screwed the little caps onto the tops of their tubes of toothpaste after the tubes had been filled. But the toothpaste cap screwer is never paid very much money, and poor Mr. Bucket, however hard he worked and however fast he screwed on the caps, he was never able to make enough to buy 1/2 of the things that such a large family needed. There wasn't even enough money to buy a proper food for them all. The only meals they could afford were bread and margarine for breakfast, boiled potatoes and cabbage for lunch, and cabbage soup for supper. Sundays were a little bit better. They all looked forward to Sundays because then, although they had exactly the same thing, everyone was allowed a second helping. The Buckets, of course, didn't starve, but every one of them, the 2 old grandfathers, the 2 old grandmothers, Charlie's father, Charlie's mother, and especially little Charlie himself, went about the morning till night with a horrible empty feeling in their tummies. Charlie felt it worst of all, and although his father and mother often went without their own share of lunch or supper so that they could give it to him, it still wasn't nearly enough. He desperately wanted something more filling and satisfying than cabbage and cabbage soup. The one thing he longed for more than anything else was chocolate. Walking to school in the morning, Charlie could see great slabs of chocolate piled up high in the shop windows. He would stop and stare and press his nose against the glass, his mouth watering like mad. Many times a day, he would see other children taking creamy candy bars out of their pockets and munching them greedily. And that, of course, was pure torture. Only once a year on his birthday did Charlie Bucket ever get to taste a bit of chocolate. The whole family saved up their money for the special occasion. And when the great day arrived, Charlie was always presented with one small chocolate bar to eat all by himself. And each time he received it, on those marvelous birthday mornings, he would place it carefully in a small wooden box that he owned and treasured it as though it were a bar of solid gold. And for the next few days, he allowed himself only to look at it, but never to touch it. Then at last, he would stand it no longer and he would peel back a tiny bit of the paper wrapping at one corner and expose a tiny bit of chocolate. And then he would take a tiny nibble, just enough to allow the lovely sweet taste to spread out slowly over his tongue. The next day, he would take another nibble, and so on, and so on. And in this way, Charlie would make his 10-cent bar of birthday chocolate last him for more than a month. But I haven't yet told you about the one awful thing that tortured little Charlie, the lover of chocolate, more than anything else. This thing for him was far, far worse than seeing slabs of chocolate in shop windows or watching other children munching creamy candy bars in front of him. It was the most terrible, torturing thing you could imagine, and it was this. In the town itself, actually within sight of his house, there was an enormous chocolate factory. Just imagine that. And it wasn't simply an ordinary, enormous chocolate factory either. It was the largest, most famous in the whole world. It was Wonka's factory, owned by the man called Mr. Willy Wonka, the greatest inventor and maker of chocolates that has ever been. And what a tremendous, marvelous piece it was. It had huge iron gates leading into it, and a high wall surrounding it, and smoke belching from its chimneys, and strange whizzing sounds coming from deep inside. And outside the walls for half miles around in every direction, the air was scented with heavy, rich smell of melting chocolate. Twice a day on his way home from school, little Charlie Bucket had to walk past the gates of the factory, and every time he went by, he would begin to walk very, very slowly. And he would hold his nose high in the air and take a long sniff of the gorgeous chocolatey smell all around him. Oh, how he loved that smell. And oh, how he wished he could go inside the factory and see what it was like. Here's a picture of Charlie, and he's sniffing the chocolatey air. Chapter 2, Willy Wonka's Factory.